"You've had enough, Mom. You don't live here anymore." The words fell from my son's lips like shards of glass, cutting through the warm Thanksgiving air that should have smelled of gratitude and love. Instead, I watched my dinner plate slip from my trembling fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a crack that echoed through the silence of what used to be my home. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show that we're strong together. My name is Margaret, and at 68 years old, I've learned that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in politeness, served on fine china, and delivered by the very people you sacrificed everything to raise. The dining room around me buzzed with conversation that no longer included me. My daughter-in-law Tessa laughed at something her friend Sarah whispered, their voices creating a wall of exclusion I couldn't penetrate. The table, my grandmother's mahogany table that had hosted 43 Thanksgivings, was set with the good china I'd carefully preserved for decades. But somehow, there wasn't enough room for the woman who'd polished every piece by hand. I stood there in my navy cardigan, the one with the tiny moth hole near the left shoulder that I'd been meaning to mend for months, holding my empty hands where my plate used to be. The cardigan hung loose on my frame now. I'd been losing weight, though no one seemed to notice. My wedding ring, Harold's final gift to me before the cancer took him 3 years ago, spun freely on my finger as I twisted it in that nervous habit I'd developed since becoming invisible in my own life. The house smelled different now. Gone was the familiar scent of my lavender sachets and Harold's pipe tobacco that had lingered in the walls for decades. Instead, Tessa's eucalyptus candles burned in every room, their medicinal sharpness making everything feel clinical, unwelcoming. Even the light seemed harsher. She'd replaced my warm yellow bulbs with those bright white LED things that made my aged hands look like road maps of liver spots and regret. "Mom, you're blocking the kitchen," Ben said without looking up from his phone, his voice carrying that particular exhaustion reserved for dealing with inconvenient elderly parents. My son, my Benjamin, who I'd rocked through countless fevers, whose scraped knees I'd kissed, whose college tuition I'd paid by working double shifts at the department store, spoke to me like I was furniture that had been placed incorrectly. I moved aside, my slippers, the comfortable ones with memory foam that Tessa constantly joked, made me look like I was heading to a nursing home, shuffling against the hardwood I'd refinished myself when Ben was 12. He'd helped me sand the boards that summer, his small hands working beside mine as we prepared for the stain that would make them gleam for decades to come. "Sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. Existing, maybe? Taking up space in the home I'd built with 40 years of mortgage payments, where every nail hammered and every wall painted carried my sweat and dreams. From the living room, I could hear Tessa's friends discussing their vacation plans, ski trips to Aspen, wine tours in Napa, Caribbean cruises, luxuries that existed in a world I'd never quite managed to enter, despite working 3 jobs to keep Ben in private school and Harold in treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. The sound of their laughter felt like music played in a key I couldn't hear, a frequency reserved for women whose value hadn't expired with their reproductive years. I retreated to the kitchen, where the chaos of Thanksgiving preparation told the story of my new place in the hierarchy. Tessa had taken over completely, her organic, free-range turkey glistening in the oven that had roasted dozens of my own birds over the years. My recipes, the stuffing Harold loved, the cranberry sauce with orange zest that Ben used to sneak spoonfuls of, had been replaced with Pinterest-worthy dishes that looked beautiful but tasted like cardboard. My hands, weathered from decades of dishwater and hard work, moved automatically to clear the broken plate pieces from the dining room floor. No one offered to help. No one even acknowledged the sound. I was the invisible woman, the ghost who cleaned up messes and faded into wallpaper, useful only for tasks that others preferred to avoid. As I knelt to gather the ceramic fragments, I caught my reflection in the glass cabinet where my mother's good china had once lived, the dishes now deemed too old-fashioned for Tessa's aesthetic. The woman looking back at me had sad eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, gray hair pulled into a practical bun because elaborate styling seemed foolish at my age, and skin that told the story of a life lived in service to others. When had I become this person? When had I agreed to shrink myself so small that my own son could dismiss me with casual cruelty? I tried to remember the last time someone had asked my opinion about anything more significant than whether I needed help getting up the stairs to my new room, the attic space that Tessa had designated as Grandma's quarters, when she decided the guest room would make a better yoga studio. The broken plate in my hands wasn't just ceramic and paint. It was the final crack in a facade I'd been maintaining for 3 years, pretending that being tolerated in my own home was the same as being loved. Pretending that my diminished role in Ben's life was natural, expected, the way things were supposed to be when children grew up and started their own families. But as I held those sharp pieces, feeling their edges press against my palms, something else began to fracture inside me. Not my heart. That had been breaking slowly for months. This was different. This was the protective shell of politeness and accommodation that had allowed me to accept the unacceptable for far too long. Somewhere in the distance, Tessa's voice called out, "Has anyone seen the good serving spoons?" My good serving spoons, inherited from my grandmother, now claimed by a woman who'd been in this family for 5 years compared to my 43. I closed my fingers around the broken ceramic, not enough to cut, but enough to remind myself that some things, once shattered, could never be whole again. Was I used? The question whispered through my mind as I stood alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of a family dinner that had no place for the woman who'd made it all possible. That night, alone in the attic room that had become my exile, I sat on the narrow twin bed that creaked with every movement, surrounded by cardboard boxes labeled Margaret's Things in Tessa's precise handwriting. The boxes contained 43 years of marriage, 28 years of motherhood, and a lifetime of memories deemed unworthy of display in the updated decor downstairs. I pulled out a shoebox filled with receipts I'd kept out of habit, evidence of a life spent giving. The first one made my chest tighten, $847 for Ben's senior class trip to Washington, D.C. I remembered working overtime at Macy's, my feet swollen in those uncomfortable dress shoes, just to make sure he wouldn't miss out while his classmates' parents wrote checks without a second thought. Behind that, a hospital bill for $12,000, Harold's first round of chemotherapy. Our insurance had covered 60%, leaving us drowning in medical debt that took 3 years to pay off. I'd sold my mother's jewelry, taken on weekend catering jobs, and cleaned offices at night while Harold slept, too weak to know how desperately we were struggling. Then came the college receipts. 4 years at State University, $127,000 total. I could see my younger self in those payment stubs, working at the department store during the day, cleaning medical offices at night, and doing alterations for neighbors on weekends. I'd worn the same 3 work outfits for 2 years, rotating them carefully so no one would notice. Meanwhile, Ben's dormitory expenses included items I couldn't even pronounce, things that seemed essential to his education, but foreign to my understanding of necessity. "You don't need to sacrifice so much, Mom," he'd said during his sophomore year, calling from his dorm room that cost more per month than our mortgage payment. But his voice had carried relief, not guilt. He was grateful I was handling it, grateful he didn't have to worry about money while his friends took spring break trips to Cancun. I found the receipt for his wedding, $15,000 that cleaned out what remained of Harold's life insurance. Tessa had wanted something elegant but not over the top, she'd said, showing me Pinterest boards filled with mason jars wrapped in burlap and fairy lights strung through barn rafters. The venue alone cost more than I'd spent on my own wedding, but I'd smiled and written the check because I wanted Ben to be happy, wanted to start his marriage without the burden of debt that had shadowed mine. During the wedding planning, I'd offered suggestions based on 30 years of hosting family gatherings, but Tessa had that special smile, the one that seemed grateful while dismissing everything I said. "That's so sweet, Margaret, but we're going for more of a modern, rustic vibe. You understand?" I didn't understand, but I nodded and kept writing checks. The house down payment receipt felt like a knife. $40,000 from Harold's 401k, withdrawn early with penalties that made my financial advisor wince. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Patterson?" he'd asked, his concern evident as he processed the paperwork. "This is most of your retirement security." But Ben and Tessa had found their dream house, a colonial in the suburbs with good schools for the grandchildren they were planning. "It's just temporary, Mom," Ben had promised. "Once I get the promotion, we'll pay you back with interest." That was 3 years ago. The promotion came, along with a new car and a kitchen renovation, but the repayment never did. Instead, 6 months after they moved in, Harold's cancer returned with a vengeance. The experimental treatments weren't covered by insurance, and our savings were gone. I found myself borrowing against the house we'd paid off, the house I'd planned to leave to Ben, to cover medical bills that mounted faster than I could work to pay them. "You should move in with us after Dad," Tessa had suggested during one of Harold's worst weeks, her voice carrying that particular tone of generous sacrifice. "We have plenty of room, and you shouldn't be alone." At the time, it had sounded like love. Looking back, I realized it had been an acquisition. I pulled out a photo from the shoebox. Harold and me on our 25th anniversary, standing in front of the azaleas I'd planted myself. He looked tired, but happy, his arm around my waist in that protective way he'd never lost, even when chemotherapy had shrunk him to almost nothing. I'd taken care of him for 2 years, learning to give injections, managing medications, sleeping in a chair beside his hospital bed during the worst weeks. When he died, Ben had been swamped at work and couldn't take time off for the funeral arrangements. I'd planned everything alone, chose the casket, wrote the obituary, selected the flowers, and paid for it all while pretending my heart wasn't breaking with every decision Harold should have been making with me. "You're so strong, Mom," people kept saying at the funeral. "Harold would be so proud of how you're handling everything." But I didn't feel strong. I felt hollow, like a house with all the furniture removed, maintaining its structure but losing its purpose. Moving in with Ben and Tessa had seemed natural, inevitable. I'd sold the house Harold and I had shared, splitting the proceeds 3 ways. 1/3 for Ben and Tessa's growing family, 1/3 invested for my future care, and 1/3 to pay off the remaining medical debts that Harold's death hadn't erased. At first, living with them had felt like family. I'd helped with dinner preparations, offered to babysit when they went out, contributed to household expenses from my modest Social Security check. But gradually, subtly, my presence had shifted from welcomed to tolerated. It started with small changes. My favorite reading chair in the living room was replaced with a sleeker model that fit the aesthetic better. My photographs were moved from the main hallway to my bedroom because the frames don't match the new decor. My cooking gradually became unnecessary as Tessa discovered meal kit services and organic delivery options that made my simple, economical recipes seem outdated and embarrassing. "You don't need to cook, Margaret," Tessa would say with that patient smile. "You've done enough cooking for one lifetime. Just relax." But relaxing felt like disappearing, like watching my usefulness evaporate until I became nothing more than an elderly relative to be managed rather than included. The monthly family meetings had started a year ago. "Just to make sure everyone's comfortable and communication stays open," Tessa had explained, her social work background evident in the therapeutic language she used to discuss my increasingly restricted role in the household. During these meetings, held around my grandmother's dining table, I learned about new house rules that seemed designed specifically for me. Quiet hours extended later into the morning. Television privileges were limited to my bedroom after 9 p.m. Guests weren't allowed without advance notice, effectively ending the few friendships I'd maintained after Harold's death. "We're just trying to maintain harmony," Ben would explain when I questioned a new restriction. "Living with multiple generations requires compromise from everyone, but somehow the compromises only flowed in one direction." I found the receipt for last Christmas. $800 spent on gifts for Ben, Tessa, and their friends' children who'd joined our Christmas morning celebration. I'd wanted to make it special, to prove my value as a grandmother and family member. But when I'd opened my own gifts, a generic scarf from the department store where I used to work, and a gift card to a restaurant I couldn't afford to use, the message had been clear. My contributions were expected. Reciprocity was not. The final receipt in the shoebox was dated just 2 months ago. $300 for the meditation studio renovation. Tessa had approached me with charts and mood boards, explaining how my former guest room could be transformed into a healing space for her new wellness coaching business. "It's really an investment in the house's value," she'd explained. her laptop open to Pinterest boards full of prayer flags and crystal collections. And you'd be contributing to something meaningful, something that helps people. She'd looked at me with those earnest eyes that made refusing feel selfish and small. So I'd written another check, watched contractors tear out the familiar blue wallpaper Harold and I had chosen together, and moved my remaining possessions to the attic space that had once stored Christmas decorations and outgrown clothes. As I sat surrounded by these boxes of my displaced life, I realized that every receipt told the same story. Margaret gives, others take. Margaret sacrifices, others benefit. Margaret disappears a little more with each transaction until she's nothing but a checking account with heartbeat. A source of funds disguised as family love. Was I used? The question wasn't whispered anymore. It echoed through my mind like a bell, clear and undeniable. 43 years of marriage, 28 years of motherhood, and 3 years of invisible elderhood had all led to this moment. Sitting alone in an attic, holding evidence of my own systematic erasure. Outside my small window, I could see the neighborhood Harold and I had chosen for its mature trees and sidewalks, where we'd imagined walking our grandchildren. Instead, I was confined to this space above it all, looking down on a life that had moved forward without me, supported by my resources but no longer enriched by my presence. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful navigation, of making myself smaller and quieter and more convenient for people who'd forgotten that convenience and love were not the same thing. But tonight, surrounded by the mathematical proof of my own generosity, I began to understand that some questions, once asked, changed everything. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke to the sound of laughter echoing from the kitchen below. For a brief, disorienting moment, I thought I was still dreaming. Perhaps Harold was making his famous pancakes while Ben helped, flour dusting their matching aprons like snow. But the voices were too bright, too young, and entirely female. I descended the narrow attic stairs, my arthritic knees protesting each step, to find Tessa hosting an impromptu brunch for her book club friends. They'd taken over my kitchen, my grandmother's cast-iron skillet sizzling with organic bacon, my hand-painted mixing bowls filled with what looked like quinoa something or other, my good silverware glinting in the morning light streaming through windows I'd washed just last week. "Oh, Margaret." Tessa's voice carried that particular brightness reserved for awkward social situations. "I hope we didn't wake you. The girls wanted to debrief last night's dinner, and you know how it is. Mimosas lead to spontaneous gatherings." She giggled, gesturing to the champagne flutes that had been wedding gifts to Harold and me 30 years ago. I stood in the doorway wearing my thin cotton nightgown and the ratty pink robe Harold had given me for Christmas 15 years ago, suddenly aware of how I must look to these women in their yoga pants and perfectly tousled hair, like an intruder in my own home, like someone who didn't belong in spaces that had once been mine. "I just need some coffee," I murmured, attempting to navigate around the cluster of perfectly manicured women who seemed to take up all the available space. "Oh, we finished the coffee," chirped Sarah, Tessa's closest friend, the one who always spoke to me in the overly enunciated tone people used for toddlers and the elderly. "But there's some herbal tea in the cabinet. The chamomile is supposed to be very calming for people your age, people my age." As if 68 were ancient. As if I were already halfway to the grave instead of a woman who'd been running households and managing crises since before these children were born. I found the tea, a box of generic store-brand chamomile that someone had clearly grabbed without thought, and stood waiting for the kettle to boil while conversation swirled around me as if I were furniture. They discussed their children's private school applications, their husbands' promotions, their upcoming spa weekends, all topics from which I was naturally excluded by virtue of my irrelevance. "I keep telling David we need to think about his mother," one woman was saying, her voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper people used when discussing inconvenient relatives. "She's getting to that age where living alone isn't really safe anymore. But the good assisted living places have such long waiting lists." The others nodded with practiced sympathy, already mentally calculating how to manage their own aging parents with minimal disruption to their comfortable lives. I wondered if they realized I was standing right there, if they understood that people my age had functioning ears and intact cognitive abilities. My tea finished steeping just as Ben appeared in the doorway, freshly showered and dressed for his Saturday golf game. He kissed Tessa's cheek and grabbed a piece of bacon from the skillet. Comfortable and proprietary in a way that reminded me how completely this space had transferred from my domain to hers. "Morning, Mom," he said without looking at me, already focused on his phone where weekend plans were apparently being coordinated. "Could you maybe keep it down up there today? Tessa's got people over and the creaking, the creaking." My footsteps across floorboards that had supported my weight for 3 years had become noise pollution, an inconvenience to be managed. I nodded silently, taking my tea and retreating to the attic like a scolded child, while laughter bubbled up from below like champagne I wasn't invited to taste. The pattern had been building for months, I realized as I sat on my narrow bed, sipping tea that tasted like disappointment. Small slights that accumulated like dust in corners, each one insignificant enough to ignore, but together forming a thick layer of dismissal that coated every interaction. My 68th birthday in August had passed with a grocery store cake and a card signed, "Love, Ben and Tessa," in handwriting that was clearly Tessa's. No family dinner, no celebration, just a perfunctory acknowledgement squeezed between their dinner plans and her evening yoga class. When I'd mentioned feeling forgotten, Ben had sighed with the exhaustion of someone whose patience was being unreasonably tested. "We're not mind readers, Mom. If you wanted something special, you should have said something. As if asking for recognition on your birthday wasn't desperate enough without having to explicitly request it." Then there was the incident with Harold's gardening tools. I'd found them at a garage sale 3 blocks away, clearly marked with his initials, being sold by a neighbor I'd never met. When I'd confronted Tessa about it, she'd looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, those old things? They were just taking up space in the garage, and the handles were so splintered. I thought we were doing you a favor by clearing them out." She'd touched my arm with practiced sympathy. "I know it's hard to let go of things that remind you of Harold, but sometimes holding on to the past prevents us from moving forward. Moving forward, as if my husband's memory were an obstacle to overcome rather than a treasure to preserve. As if the tools he'd used to create the garden where we'd shared morning coffee for 20 years were just clutter to be eliminated in the name of progress. The medical appointment incident had been even worse. I'd been having persistent headaches for weeks, finally scheduling a doctor's visit that required transportation since Tessa had declared my driving unsafe after I'd scraped the garage door frame pulling out too quickly. When the appointment day arrived, I'd found a note on the kitchen counter. "Sorry. Emergency at work. Can you Uber?" T. I'd never used Uber. The technology felt foreign and intimidating. But more than that, the casual abandonment stung. I'd driven these people to countless appointments over the years. Ben's orthodontist visits, Tessa's prenatal checkups, routine maintenance that family members provided for each other without question or fanfare. I'd rescheduled the appointment and suffered through another week of headaches, telling myself it wasn't that serious, that my health concerns weren't worth the inconvenience they'd cause others. But it was the Thanksgiving seating arrangement that had truly opened my eyes. I'd arrived in the dining room to find place cards written in Tessa's calligraphy, names arranged around my grandmother's table like a carefully orchestrated social experiment. Tessa's friends occupied the central seats, their conversations flowing easily across the polished surface. Ben sat at the head where Harold used to preside, discussing work with another husband who'd been grudgingly included. My place card sat at the far end, squeezed between the wall and a serving cart, positioned where I could serve and clear dishes but couldn't participate in actual conversation. When I'd quietly moved my place setting closer to the center, Tessa had noticed immediately. "Oh, Margaret, I had you down there because I thought you'd be more comfortable with easier access to the kitchen," she'd explained with that patient smile. "You know how you like to keep busy during dinner parties." Keep busy. As if my decades of hosting experience were nothing more than compulsive tidying. As if my contributions to family gatherings were purely functional rather than social. I'd moved back to the designated spot, understanding for the first time that I'd been categorized as help rather than family. The realization had crystallized during dessert service, when I'd automatically risen to clear plates while the others continued their conversation. No one thanked me, no one offered to help. They simply continued talking while I moved around them like invisible staff, collecting the dishes I'd purchased, serving the pie I'd baked despite being told my cooking wasn't needed. "Margaret makes the most amazing apple pie," Tessa had mentioned to her friends, her voice carrying the kind of praise typically reserved for talented servants. It's such a comfort to have someone who really knows their way around traditional recipes. Traditional recipes. Code for outdated, old-fashioned, not quite sophisticated enough for modern palates, but acceptable for novelty purposes. I'd stood in the kitchen washing dishes that others had dirtied, listening to conversation that continued without me, understanding that I'd become a curiosity in my own home, the elderly relative who provided useful services while remaining socially irrelevant. But the discovery that shattered my remaining illusions came 2 weeks later, when I'd been looking for stamps in the desk drawer where important documents were kept. I'd found printouts of assisted living facilities, Sunset Manor, Golden Years Community, Peaceful Meadows Residence, each with pricing information and availability dates carefully highlighted in Tessa's preferred yellow marker. The notes in the margins made my blood freeze. Waitlist, 8 months. Memory care available. Accept Medicaid after 2 years private pay. These weren't casual inquiries. These were detailed investigations into my future disposal. Research conducted without my knowledge or consent while I continued to contribute financially to a household that was already planning my exit. At the bottom of the pile, I found a printed email exchange between Ben and someone named Patricia Caldwell, LCSW, MSW, apparently a geriatric care manager who specialized in difficult family transitions. Thanks for the consultation, Ben had written. You're right that waiting too long makes the transition harder for everyone involved. We're looking at spring timeline, after the holidays. Mom has some assets that will cover initial costs, and her Social Security should handle monthly fees once we get everything properly arranged. Mom has some assets. As if I were already incompetent, as if my financial resources were theirs to manage and allocate, as if the woman who'd supported this family for decades was nothing more than a financial planning problem to be solved efficiently and with minimal disruption to their comfortable lives. I sat on my narrow attic bed, holding evidence of my own planned abandonment, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not my heart. That had been breaking gradually for months. This was different. This was the moment when politeness died and clarity was born, when the weight of accumulated cruelties finally exceeded my capacity to bear them with grace. They weren't waiting for me to become incompetent. They weren't concerned about my safety or well-being. They were simply tired of accommodating my existence in their upgraded life, ready to warehouse me somewhere convenient where my needs wouldn't interfere with their plans. I was 68 years old, not 98. I had a clear mind, steady hands, and at least 20 good years ahead of me. But in their calculations, I'd already been written off as a problem requiring professional management, rather than a person deserving love and respect. The question wasn't, was I used, anymore. The question had become, what was I going to do about it? The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years of living under their roof. I stayed in bed past 8 o'clock. Not because I was sick or tired, but because I chose to. The floorboards didn't creak with my usual early morning routine. The coffee didn't brew automatically at 7:30. The newspaper didn't appear, folded and waiting, on the kitchen counter. By 9:15, Ben was knocking on my attic door. "Mom, everything okay up there?" His voice carried that particular note of irritation disguised as concern. The tone of someone whose morning routine had been disrupted by staff who'd failed to show up for work. "I'm fine, Benjamin," I called back, using his full name intentionally for the first time in years. "Just resting. But the coffee. And Tessa needs the kitchen for her client consultation at 10. I pulled the covers higher and closed my eyes. I'm sure Tessa can figure out how to operate a coffee maker. She's a very capable woman. The silence that followed was pregnant with confusion. Margaret didn't refuse requests. Margaret didn't stay in bed when others needed things. Margaret certainly didn't speak with this unfamiliar edge of, was that sarcasm? 20 minutes later, Tessa's voice joined the conversation, floating up through the thin attic walls with artificial sweetness. "Margaret, we're worried about you. This isn't like you at all." And there it was. The truth hidden in plain sight. This wasn't like me. The me they'd grown accustomed to was endlessly accommodating, perpetually available, reliably invisible except when my services were required. They'd never had to wonder where I was or what I was thinking, because I'd trained them not to consider me as a person with independent thoughts and desires. "I'm perfectly fine," I replied, my voice steady and calm. "I'm just taking a day to think." "Oh, think about what?" Ben's voice had shifted to that careful therapeutic tone he'd learned from watching Tessa manage difficult clients. "Is this about yesterday? Because if you felt left out at dinner, we can talk about that. Communication is really important in multi-generational households." Multi-generational households. As if we were participating in some sociological experiment rather than what used to be called a family. As if my feelings were symptoms to be managed rather than legitimate responses to systematic exclusion. I didn't answer. Instead, I lay in my narrow bed and listened to them whisper in the hallway below, their voices carrying the urgency of people whose comfortable arrangements had suddenly become complicated. "Should we call Dr. Peterson?" Tessa suggested. "Sometimes depression in elderly people manifests as behavioral changes." Elderly people. Not Margaret. Not Ben's mother. Not a woman with a name and a history and valid emotional responses to legitimate grievances. Just a demographic category exhibiting inconvenient symptoms. "She's probably just having a mood," Ben replied with the confident dismissal of someone who'd never had his moods pathologized and medicalized. "You know how she gets sometimes. Give her some space, and she'll be back to normal by this afternoon." Normal. As if my decades of accommodation represented my natural state, rather than a choice I'd been making daily to preserve family harmony. As if Margaret the service provider was my authentic self, rather than a role I'd been performing so convincingly that everyone, including me, had forgotten it was an act. I spent that first day of rebellion doing something revolutionary. Nothing. I read a novel Harold had given me years ago that I'd never had time to finish. I looked through photo albums that had been banished to my room, remembering versions of myself who'd smiled with genuine happiness rather than practiced politeness. I examined my reflection in the small mirror above my dresser, trying to recognize the woman I'd been before I'd become so skilled at disappearing. By afternoon, the household's rhythm had adjusted around my absence like water flowing around a stone. Tessa had made her own coffee, conducted her client consultation without my invisible support, and managed lunch preparations with the kind of efficiency that proved she'd never actually needed my help, only my compliance. But as evening approached, my rebellion began to affect their comfort in ways that couldn't be so easily dismissed. "Mom, what are we doing about dinner?" Ben called up the stairs at 6 o'clock, his voice carrying the expectation that this question would restore normal operations. "I'm not sure what you're doing," I replied calmly. "I'm having a yogurt and some crackers." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret had always handled dinner, even when told her cooking wasn't needed. Margaret had always ensured that food appeared on tables, that kitchens remained functional, that the invisible labor of household management continued seamlessly, regardless of whether anyone acknowledged or appreciated her contributions. 30 minutes later, I heard Ben's voice on the phone ordering pizza, his tone slightly petulant as he navigated a task he hadn't performed in years. When the delivery arrived, I listened to them eating below, their conversation noticeably subdued by the absence of the woman who usually facilitated their comfort while requiring nothing in return. The next morning, I implemented phase 2 of my inadvertent revolution. I stopped doing their laundry. "Margaret?" Tessa approached me carefully around noon, finding me reading in the living room chair I'd reclaimed from exile. "I noticed the laundry situation is getting a bit backed up. Are you feeling overwhelmed? Because I can help you organize a schedule that works better for everyone." I looked up from my book, a mystery novel where justice actually prevailed, and smiled with the kind of patience typically reserved for slow children. "I'm not overwhelmed, Tessa. I'm simply not doing your laundry anymore." Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in confusion. "I'm sorry. What?" "I'm 68 years old," I explained pleasantly. "I've been doing laundry for 50 years. I've earned the right to only wash my own clothes from now on. But what about our things? Ben's work shirts need special care, and my yoga clothes require delicate cycles. I'm sure you'll figure it out. You're both very intelligent adults." This was the moment when confusion transformed into something sharper. Tessa's social work training had apparently included modules on managing difficult elderly relatives because her entire demeanor shifted to professional crisis intervention mode. Margaret, I think we need to have a family meeting about these changes in your behavior. It's important that we maintain open communication and address any underlying issues that might be causing this adjustment period. Underlying issues. Adjustment period. The clinical language flowed so smoothly that I wondered how many times she'd rehearsed this conversation in her head, how many strategies she'd developed for managing the inconvenient autonomy of people she'd categorized as dependents. I don't think a meeting is necessary, I replied, returning to my book. I think clarity is necessary, and I'm finally achieving some. That afternoon, Ben came home from work to find his wife struggling with an unfamiliar washing machine, muttering about water temperatures and fabric softener while I sat peacefully in the living room, reading and occasionally sipping tea from my grandmother's china cup, the one that had been relegated to my attic room, but which I'd decided belonged wherever I chose to use it. Mom, can we talk? Ben's voice carried the strained patience of someone whose life had suddenly become unnecessarily complicated by people who were supposed to make things easier. I marked my place in the novel and folded my hands in my lap, giving him my full attention in a way I realized I hadn't done in years. When had I stopped looking directly at my son during conversations? When had I learned to keep my eyes downcast, my posture apologetic, my presence as unobtrusive as possible? Of course, dear. What would you like to talk about? Whatever this is you're doing, the not helping with things, the staying in your room, the attitude. He gestured vaguely, as if my newfound visibility were a mysterious ailment requiring diagnosis. It's not like you. You're absolutely right, I agreed cheerfully. It's not like the me you've grown accustomed to, but it is very much like the me I used to be before I learned to make myself invisible for everyone else's comfort. Ben's face cycled through expressions like a slideshow: confusion, frustration, concern, and finally something that looked almost like fear. Because if Margaret could stop being the accommodating ghost who managed household inconveniences, if Margaret could develop opinions and boundaries and independent will, then what other assumptions about his comfortable life might prove equally unstable? Are you having some kind of episode? He asked carefully. Because Tessa knows people who specialize in senior mental health, and maybe talking to someone professional would help you work through whatever you're going through. Senior mental health, professional help. The pathologizing had begun in earnest now, the systematic redefinition of my awakening as illness, my clarity as confusion, my self-respect as symptoms requiring treatment. Benjamin, I said, my voice carrying a firmness I hadn't used since he was a child testing boundaries. I am not having an episode. I am having a realization. There's a significant difference. A realization about what? I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in months. When had his face become so soft, so unmarked by genuine struggle or sacrifice? When had his eyes developed that expectant expression, that assumption that the universe existed to serve his comfort and convenience? I'd worked so hard to protect him from life's difficulties that I'd raised a man who couldn't imagine any perspective beyond his own immediate needs. I've realized, I said slowly, choosing my words with the precision of someone who'd finally decided truth was more important than peace, that somewhere along the way, I stopped being your mother and became your employee, and you stopped being my son and became my employer, and not a particularly grateful or generous employer at that. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, visible and toxic, and impossible to ignore. Ben's mouth opened and closed several times, his face cycling through denials and justifications, before settling on wounded indignation. That's not fair, Mom. Everything we do is because we care about you. We invited you to live with us when Dad died. We include you in family activities. We make sure you're safe and comfortable. How can you say we treat you like an employee? When was the last time you asked my opinion about anything that mattered? I countered quietly. When was the last time you considered my preferences when making decisions that affected my life? When was the last time you thanked me for any of the 1,000 small things I do to make your household function smoothly? We appreciate everything you do. No, Benjamin. You expect everything I do. there's a world of difference. By evening, Tessa had called for reinforcements. Her mother, Patricia, a woman who'd managed her own elderly parents with the efficient ruthlessness of a corporate restructuring expert, arrived with casseroles and concerned expressions, ready to deploy whatever strategies had successfully managed previous family crises. "Margaret, honey," Patricia began with the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to difficult conversations, "Tessa's told me you're going through a rough patch. It's so normal for people your age to feel displaced when living situations change. Have you considered that maybe some professional counseling might help you adjust?" People your age. The phrase had become a verbal weapon, wielded with surgical precision to dismiss any inconvenient autonomy I might display, as if reaching 68 had automatically disqualified me from having valid opinions or legitimate grievances. "Thank you for your concern, Patricia," I replied with my own practiced warmth. "But I'm not feeling displaced. I'm feeling clear-headed for the first time in years." And I was. With each hour that passed, each small rebellion that went unchallenged, I felt myself becoming more solid, more present, more undeniably real. The ghost who'd haunted my own life was finally, gradually, remembering what it felt like to cast a shadow. The turning point came on a Wednesday morning when I found Tessa in my kitchen, explaining to a contractor why the cabinets needed to be replaced with something more contemporary for her expanding wellness business. She gestured enthusiastically at my grandmother's hand-painted cabinet doors, dismissing 60 years of family history as dated charm that doesn't photograph well for social media. "The good news is that Margaret won't mind contributing to the renovation," she was saying, her voice carrying that confident assumption that had become so familiar. "She's always been so generous about improvements that benefit the whole family." I stood in the doorway, invisible as usual, listening to my financial resources being allocated without my knowledge or consent. Again, the contractor was quoting numbers that made my monthly Social Security check look like pocket change, discussing timelines and material costs while Tessa nodded as if money were an infinite resource that appeared magically whenever she required it. "Actually," I said, stepping into the room with a calmness that surprised even me, "I will mind. Quite a lot, in fact." Both Tessa and the contractor turned to stare at me as if a piece of furniture had suddenly developed opinions. The contractor looked confused. Clearly, he'd been under the impression that this was Tessa's house, Tessa's decision, Tessa's money. "Margaret!" Tessa laughed with that nervous brightness people used when elderly relatives said embarrassing things in public. "We discussed this. The kitchen renovation is an investment in the property value. Everyone benefits." "We didn't discuss anything," I replied evenly. "You informed me of your decision and assumed I would fund it." "There's a significant difference." The contractor shifted uncomfortably, his measuring tape frozen mid-extension as he recognized the signs of a family dispute he had no interest in mediating. "Should I come back another time?" "That would be perfect," I said, before Tessa could respond. "Because there won't be any renovation. At least not one funded by me." After the contractor left, Tessa sat at my grandmother's kitchen table, the same table where she'd been planning to replace my grandmother's cabinets, and deployed her most practiced therapeutic techniques. "Margaret, I understand that change can feel overwhelming, especially for people in your stage of life," she began, her voice taking on that professional counselor tone. "But resisting every suggestion isn't really about kitchen cabinets, is it? This is about feeling like you don't have control over your environment." Stage of life. As if I'd entered some predetermined phase where my opinions automatically became symptoms of decline rather than legitimate preferences. As if wanting to preserve my family's history made me mentally unstable rather than emotionally connected to my own past. "You're absolutely right," I agreed, surprising her with my ready acceptance. "This is about control, and I'm taking mine back." That afternoon, I did something I should have done months ago. I drove to the bank. My Honda Civic started on the first try, as reliable as ever, despite Tessa's campaigns about my unsafe driving. I'd been avoiding the car, accepting their narrative that my reflexes were too slow, my judgment too compromised, my very presence on the road a danger to society. But as I navigated familiar streets with the competence I'd maintained for 50 years of driving, I realized that my so-called impairment existed only in their convenient imagination. At First National, I met with Jennifer Walsh, the same banker who'd handled my account since Harold and I had opened them 23 years ago. Jennifer had aged alongside me, her dark hair now silvered, her face lined with the experiences of someone who'd weathered economic downturns and personal losses while maintaining her professional dignity. "Margaret," she said warmly, ushering me into her office. "It's been too long. How are you managing since Harold passed?" The question was simple, but her genuine concern for my well-being, the first I'd encountered in months from anyone besides healthcare providers, almost brought tears to my eyes. When had I become so starved for basic human consideration that ordinary kindness felt extraordinary? "I'm managing better than I thought," I replied, settling into the comfortable chair across from her desk. "In fact, I'm here because I need to make some changes to my accounts." Jennifer pulled up my information on her computer, her professional expression shifting slightly as she reviewed the activity. "I see you've been quite generous with family support," she observed diplomatically. "That $15,000 transfer in August and another $8,000 in September. Too generous," I admitted. "I need to establish some boundaries." What followed was the most empowering conversation I'd had in years. Jennifer walked me through my options with the patience of someone who understood that financial independence wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, autonomy, and the fundamental right to control your own resources. I opened a new checking account, one that required only my signature for access. I moved the majority of my savings into certificates of deposit that couldn't be accessed without my physical presence and identification. I arranged for my Social Security and pension payments to be deposited into the new account, leaving only a small amount in the old joint account that Ben and Tessa had grown accustomed to using as their personal expense fund. "Are you sure about this?" Jennifer asked. Not because she disagreed with my decisions, but because she wanted to ensure I'd considered all the implications. Once these changes take effect, anyone who's been accessing your old account won't be able to continue doing so. "That's exactly the point," I said, signing the paperwork with hands that felt steadier than they had in months. The drive home felt different. The same streets, the same neighborhoods, but I was returning as someone who'd reclaimed control over her own life, rather than someone who merely existed at the mercy of other people's decisions. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like Margaret Patterson again, instead of Margaret the elderly relative to be managed. I arrived home to find Ben's car in the driveway earlier than usual, a sign that the household crisis of my newfound independence was affecting his work schedule. Through the kitchen window, I could see him and Tessa engaged in intense conversation, their body language radiating the kind of focused urgency typically reserved for genuine emergencies. I entered through the front door, my keys jingling with the confidence of someone who belonged in this space, who had every right to come and go as she pleased. The conversation stopped abruptly when they heard me, both of them turning with expressions that managed to combine relief and suspicion in equal measure. "Mom, where were you?" Ben's voice carried that particular parental concern that had somehow inverted our relationship, as if I were the child who'd wandered off without permission. "I was at the bank," I replied pleasantly, hanging my coat in the closet and moving toward the kitchen where I planned to make myself a cup of tea using my good china and my expensive tea bags, both of which I'd been unconsciously rationing as if my own comfort were a luxury I couldn't afford. "The bank?" Tessa's voice sharpened with interest. "Is everything all right?" Sometimes elderly people become confused about their finances, and banks can take advantage. Elderly people. The phrase had become their universal explanation for any behavior that didn't conform to their expectations of my continued compliance. "Everything is perfect," I assured her, filling the kettle with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. "I've just made some adjustments to my accounts to better reflect my current priorities." "What kind of adjustments?" Ben's question carried the urgent undertone of someone whose comfortable assumptions were being challenged by inconvenient realities. I turned to face them both. These two adults who'd somehow convinced themselves that my financial resources were theirs to manage and allocate, and smiled with the serene confidence of someone who'd finally remembered her own worth. "I've established financial independence," I explained simply. My money will now be used for my priorities rather than automatically funding everyone else's preferences. The silence that followed was profound. I could see them processing the implications, calculating how this change would affect their kitchen renovation plans. Their casual assumption that Margaret money would always be available for Margaret purposes, while Margaret herself remained conveniently invisible. But what about the family expenses? Tessa asked carefully. The household costs, the renovations we discussed, the improvements that benefit everyone? What about them? I countered gently. You're both employed adults with your own incomes. I'm sure you'll manage beautifully. Ben's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine. Confusion, frustration, panic, and finally something that looked suspiciously like fear. Because if I could withdraw my financial support as easily as I'd been providing it, if I could establish boundaries around my resources as firmly as they'd established boundaries around my social participation, then what other assumptions about our arrangement might prove equally unstable? Mom, this is... He started, then stopped, apparently unable to articulate exactly what this was, without admitting that their household had been operating on a foundation of financial exploitation disguised as family love. This is me learning to say no, I finished for him. It's a skill I should have developed years ago. That evening, I enjoyed my first solitary dinner in my own home, not because I was being excluded, but because I chose to eat alone. I prepared exactly what I wanted. A simple omelet with herbs from the garden Harold had planted. Toast from bread I'd baked myself. Tea from leaves I'd selected for my own palate rather than someone else's preferences. I ate slowly, savoring each bite while reading my novel, occasionally glancing out the window at the garden where daffodils were beginning to emerge despite the late autumn chill. Spring bulbs that Harold had planted in his final year, timing their bloom to remind me that some things endure regardless of who tends them. That beauty has its own schedule, independent of human convenience or approval. From somewhere in the house, I could hear muffled conversations, urgent phone calls, the sound of people suddenly forced to confront the reality that their comfortable lifestyle had been subsidized by someone they'd systematically devalued and dismissed. But for the first time in 3 years, their crisis wasn't mine to solve. Their problems weren't mine to fund. Their comfort wasn't my responsibility to ensure at the expense of my own dignity and well-being. I was 68 years old, and I had finally learned the revolutionary act of putting myself first. Not exclusively, not selfishly, but simply first among equals, rather than last in line for consideration in my own life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new attempts to restore the previous dynamic through guilt, manipulation, or therapeutic redefinition of my autonomy as illness. But tonight, I was just a woman eating dinner in her own house, using her own money, making her own choices, and it felt like coming home to myself after a very long exile. The explosion came 3 days later, when Ben discovered that his automatic payment for his golf club membership had been declined. He stormed into the house at 7:30 in the morning, still wearing his golf attire, his face flushed with the particular humiliation of a man who'd been publicly embarrassed at the 19th hole. "Mom!" His voice echoed through the house with an urgency I hadn't heard since he was 16 and had wrecked his first car. "We need to talk. Now." I was in the garden, deadheading the last roses of the season while sipping coffee from Harold's favorite mug, the one with the chip in the handle that Tessa had repeatedly tried to throw away. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the promise of winter's approach. I'd been enjoying the solitude, the simple pleasure of tending something beautiful without anyone questioning my methods or suggesting improvements. "Good morning, Benjamin," I replied without looking up from the roses. "How was your golf game?" "There was no golf game," he snapped, his voice carrying the brittle edge of someone whose carefully constructed life was developing unexpected cracks. "Because my membership payment bounced? Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? Standing there while they ran my card 3 times before suggesting I contact my bank?" I continued my methodical deadheading, each cut precise and deliberate. "I imagine it was quite uncomfortable. Banks can be so unforgiving about insufficient funds." "That's just it. There should have been sufficient funds. The account you've been contributing to, The one that covers our family expenses. It's empty, Mom. Completely empty. Our family expenses. Even in crisis, he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that his golf membership, his expensive lunches, his casual purchases had been funded by his elderly mother's fixed income, rather than his own salary. I see, I said calmly, moving to the next rosebush. That must have been quite a shock. A shock? His voice cracked slightly. Mom, they're talking about suspending my membership until I can bring the account current. Do you understand what that means? I've been a member there for 8 years. These are business relationships, professional connections, people I work with every day. I finally looked up from my gardening, studying my son's face with the attention I might give to a stranger asking for directions. When had he become this person? This man who measured his worth by his ability to maintain expensive memberships, who valued professional connections more than family relationships, who could stand in his mother's garden and demand she fund his social status without a trace of shame or self-awareness. Benjamin, I said gently, you're 45 years old. You have a master's degree and a 6-figure salary. Why exactly do you need your mother to pay for your golf membership? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge, forcing him to confront the fundamental absurdity of a successful middle-aged man expecting his retired mother to subsidize his recreational activities. It's not about need, he said defensively. It's about the arrangement we had. The family financial system that's worked perfectly well for everyone until you suddenly decided to change everything without warning. The family financial system. As if my systematic exploitation had been a formal agreement rather than a gradual erosion of boundaries that I'd been too polite, too accommodating, too well-trained in feminine self-sacrifice to resist. What arrangement was that exactly? I asked, genuinely curious to hear how he would articulate the dynamics that had somehow made my money his right, rather than his mother's resource. I don't recall signing any documents that made me responsible for your lifestyle expenses. Before Ben could answer, Tessa appeared at the garden gate, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice carrying the strained patience of someone who'd been on hold with customer service representatives for far too long. Yes, I understand the payment was declined, she was saying, her yoga mat tucked under one arm, her wellness coaching certification visible in the professional tote bag that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. But this is clearly some kind of banking error. The funds have always been available before. She ended the call with visible frustration, her carefully curated serenity cracking to reveal the anger beneath. Margaret, there's something wrong with the financial accounts. My business insurance payment bounced, my studio rental fee was declined, and now they're threatening to cancel my certification program because the final payment didn't go through. Your business insurance, your studio rental, your certification program, all funded apparently by someone else's money while being described as personal achievements and professional investments. There's nothing wrong with the accounts, I replied, returning to my roses with the focused attention of someone who'd found better uses for her time than managing other people's financial crises. I've simply reorganized my resources to better reflect my own priorities. Your priorities? Tessa's voice climbed toward hysteria. Margaret, these aren't luxury expenses. This is my business, my career, my contribution to the family income. I paused in my gardening, genuinely intrigued by this novel interpretation of events. Your contribution to the family income, the business that I've been funding from startup costs to operational expenses, the career that I've been subsidizing while receiving no return on my investment, that contribution? The silence that followed was filled only by the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of dying leaves in the wind. Both Ben and Tessa stood frozen, apparently struggling to process a version of reality where Margaret had opinions about how Margaret's money was being spent. Mom, Ben said finally, his voice taking on the careful tone people used when negotiating with unstable personalities, I think you're confused about how family finances work. When people live together, when they share a household, everyone contributes according to their ability. You have resources that others don't, so naturally I should fund everyone else's dreams while my own needs become irrelevant, I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying a steel core that surprised all three of us. Naturally, my Social Security and pension should pay for your golf memberships and Tessa's business ventures while I wear clothes from discount stores and postpone my own medical appointments because I can't afford the copays? You never said you couldn't afford things, Tessa protested. You never asked for help with your expenses. How were we supposed to know you were struggling? The breathtaking audacity of this statement, that my financial struggles were my fault for not adequately communicating them while simultaneously funding their comfortable lifestyle, left me momentarily speechless. I wasn't struggling, I said finally. I was sacrificing. There's a difference. And I was doing it because I believed family members supported each other during difficult times, that my contributions were investments in relationships that would provide emotional returns, even if the financial costs were significant. We do support each other, Ben insisted. We're a family. We take care of each other. Really? I set down my gardening shears and gave him my full attention. When was the last time either of you took care of me? When was the last time you asked about my health, my happiness, my plans for the future? When was the last time you considered my preferences when making household decisions? Or thanked me for any of the hundreds of ways I've made your lives easier and more comfortable? They exchanged glances. That rapid visual communication couples developed when confronting united resistance to their shared assumptions. I could see them recalibrating, searching for new strategies to restore the previous dynamic. If you felt unappreciated, you should have said something, Tessa said, her therapeutic training evident in her careful word choices. Communication is so important in multi-generational living situations. We can't address problems we don't know exist. Multi-generational living situations. Even in crisis, she couldn't refer to our arrangement as a family, couldn't acknowledge that my grievances might be legitimate, rather than symptoms of poor communication skills. I'm saying something now, I replied simply. I'm saying that the current arrangement isn't working for me, and I'm making changes to ensure my own well-being and financial security. What about our well-being? Ben's voice carried the indignant tone of someone whose comfortable assumptions were being challenged by inconvenient realities. What about the commitments we've made based on the financial arrangements that have been in place for years? Our well-being. The commitments they had made using my money without consulting me about their sustainability, or my continued willingness to fund them. What about them? I asked genuinely. You're both intelligent, capable adults with professional incomes. I'm sure you'll adjust your commitments to match your actual resources rather than your assumed access to mine. The garden gate creaked as a neighbor's cat wandered through, pausing to observe our family drama with the detached interest of someone who understood that human conflicts rarely affected the availability of sunny spots for afternoon naps. I envied the cat's immunity to emotional manipulation, its clear understanding of its own needs and boundaries. Mom, you're not thinking clearly, Ben said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone reserved for confused elderly relatives. These changes you're making, this sudden selfishness, it's not like you. Maybe we should schedule an appointment with Dr. Peterson, get you checked for changes in mental status that sometimes happen to people your age. Sudden selfishness. Mental status changes. The pathologizing had reached full intensity now, the systematic redefinition of my financial independence as cognitive decline, my self-advocacy as symptoms requiring medical intervention. Benjamin, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd wielded when he was young and testing boundaries. The only thing that's changed about my mental status is that I've remembered I have one. For 3 years, I've been so focused on keeping everyone else happy that I forgot I was a person with my own rights, needs, and preferences. That's not dementia. That's recovery. I gathered my gardening tools with deliberate care, each movement reflecting the precision and competence of someone whose faculties were functioning perfectly well. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have things to do. Things that don't involve solving financial problems I didn't create for people who've forgotten that gratitude and respect are prerequisites for continued generosity. As I walked toward the house, leaving them standing in the garden with their crisis and their outrage, I heard Tessa whisper urgently to Ben, "We need to call Patricia. This is escalating beyond what we can handle ourselves." Patricia, the mother-in-law who specialized in managing inconvenient elderly relatives. The reinforcements being called in to restore order to a household where the funding source had developed opinions about how funds were used. But I wasn't worried about Patricia or any other expert in elderly management. For the first time in 3 years, I was more interested in my own opinions than in other people's strategies for changing them. The morning after the garden confrontation, I woke with a lightness I hadn't felt since Harold's illness began. Sunlight streamed through my attic window, painting golden rectangles on the floor where dust motes danced like celebration confetti. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't mentally calculating anyone else's needs before considering my own. The freedom was intoxicating. I dressed carefully that morning, not in the practical clothes I'd adopted for invisibility, but in the navy silk blouse Harold had loved, and the pearl earrings my mother had given me for my wedding. I was going somewhere special, somewhere I'd been dreaming about since I'd found that travel brochure tucked between the pages of a library book 2 months ago. The house below buzzed with urgent conversations and phone calls, but their crisis no longer pulled at my attention like a magnetic force. I could hear Tessa's voice, strained with the particular panic of someone whose carefully constructed life was developing cracks, but her problems felt distant, irrelevant to my own awakening sense of possibility. I made coffee using the expensive beans I'd been saving for special occasions, apparently unaware that being alive and free was special enough. The coffee tasted like liquid gold, rich and complex in a way that the store-brand economy blend could never match. How many small pleasures had I denied myself in the name of being economical, practical, invisible? Downtown Springfield bustled with the energy of people pursuing their own dreams and ambitions. I parked in front of Wanderlust Travel, a small agency I'd passed hundreds of times without ever imagining I had the right to enter. The window display showed photographs of places that existed in my imagination. Greek islands with whitewashed buildings tumbling toward impossibly blue water, Tuscan hillsides dotted with ancient olive trees, Parisian cafes where women my age sat alone with books and wine, looking perfectly content with their own company. The bell chimed as I entered, and a young woman with kind eyes and silver rings on every finger looked up from her computer with genuine welcome. Her name tag read, Sophie, and something in her manner suggested she understood that travel wasn't just about geography. It was about transformation. "How can I help you today?" she asked, her voice carrying none of the condescending patience people often used with elderly customers, as if age automatically diminished our capacity for adventure. "I want to go to Greece," I said simply, the words feeling foreign and wonderful in my mouth. "I want to see the islands Harold and I dreamed about visiting. I want to eat real Greek food and watch sunsets over the Aegean Sea and feel like I'm living my life instead of just maintaining it." Sophie's smile was brilliant. "How wonderful! Are you thinking of a tour group, or would you prefer to travel independently?" The question caught me off guard. I'd automatically assumed I'd need the structure and safety of organized travel, the kind of supervised adventure designed for people whose families worried about their competence. But as I considered the options, I realized that my need for supervision existed mainly in other people's imagination. "Independently," I heard myself say. "I want to make my own schedule, choose my own restaurants, get lost and find myself again. I've spent enough years following other people's itineraries." Over the next hour, Sophie and I planned a trip that felt like designing a new life. 3 weeks in Greece, starting in Athens and island hopping through the Cyclades. A small hotel in Santorini with a balcony overlooking the caldera, cooking classes in Crete, archaeological sites where I could touch stones that had witnessed civilizations rise and fall long before my current problems existed. "It's going to be expensive," Sophie warned gently, not because she wanted to discourage me, but because she'd seen too many dreams deferred by financial reality. "I have the money," I replied, and for the first time in years, that statement felt like a celebration rather than a burden. For 47 years, I've been saving for a rainy day. I think it's time to acknowledge that the rain has stopped. I paid the deposit with my new debit card, the one connected to my independent account, watching the numbers decrease with joy rather than anxiety. This wasn't money flowing away from me. This was money flowing toward my dreams, my experiences, my right to exist as someone whose happiness mattered. The travel insurance paperwork asked for emergency contacts, and I paused over the form. For decades, the answer would have been automatic. Harold, then Ben. But now? I wrote down Jennifer at the bank and Sophie at the travel agency, people who saw me as competent and deserving rather than fragile and problematic. Walking out of the travel agency with my itinerary and boarding passes, I felt like I was carrying a passport to a new version of myself. The woman who would board that plane to Athens in 6 weeks bore little resemblance to the ghost who'd been haunting her own life just days ago. My phone buzzed with a text from Ben. "Mom, we need to talk. This has gone far enough." But I slipped the phone back into my purse without responding. Their emergency was no longer my urgency. Instead, I drove to the mall. Not to the practical stores where I'd been buying generic everything for years, but to the department store where I'd once worked, where I knew the salespeople still remembered quality over price tags. Mrs. Patterson! Amanda, one of the personal shoppers, greeted me with the warmth reserved for valued customers. "I haven't seen you in ages. What brings you in today?" "I'm going to Greece," I announced, the words still feeling magical. "I need clothes that make me feel like the kind of woman who travels alone to beautiful places and doesn't apologize for taking up space." Amanda's eyes lit up with the particular joy of someone who understood that clothing could be transformational. "Oh, we're going to have so much fun." For 2 hours, I tried on clothes that had nothing to do with practicality or economy. A flowing white dress that made me feel like a Greek goddess. Comfortable walking shoes that looked elegant enough for evening dinners. A sun hat that cast mysterious shadows across my face. A swimsuit, the first I'd owned in 5 years, that made me remember I had a body worth celebrating. With each garment, I shed more of the invisibility I'd wrapped around myself like protective armor. The woman in the dressing room mirror had good posture, bright eyes, and the kind of smile that came from someone who'd remembered she deserved to feel beautiful. "You look radiant," Amanda said as she rang up my purchases. "This trip is going to be life-changing." "It already is," I replied, watching my new credit card process the transaction without guilt or anxiety. "I'm changing before I even leave." That evening, I cooked dinner for myself using ingredients I'd chosen purely for pleasure rather than price. Fresh salmon, asparagus, a bottle of white wine that cost more than I'd typically spend on groceries for a week. I set my grandmother's table with the good china, lit candles for no reason other than candlelight made everything more beautiful, and dined like someone whose company I actually enjoyed. The house around me buzzed with tense conversations, urgent phone calls, and the particular energy of people whose comfortable assumptions were collapsing. But their crisis existed in a parallel universe now, one where my well-being was secondary to their convenience. As I sipped my wine and watched the sunset paint my garden in shades of gold and amber, I realized I was experiencing something I hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. Not anxiety about tomorrow's responsibilities or dread about conflicts to be managed, but genuine excitement about the life unfolding ahead of me. My phone rang with Patricia's number, the cavalry arriving to restore order to their disrupted household. But I let it go to voicemail, more interested in the way the setting sun made my wine glass glow like liquid amber than in whatever therapeutic strategies were being deployed to manage my inconvenient autonomy. Later, alone in my room, I spread my travel itinerary across my bed and traced routes between islands with my finger. In 6 weeks, I would be watching sunset from a different continent, eating food prepared by people who'd never heard of my family's problems, sleeping in a bed I'd chosen because it overlooked beauty, rather than because it was practical and unobtrusive. I pulled out the photo of Harold and me on our anniversary, the one where we both looked tired but hopeful. "I'm going to see those places we dreamed about," I whispered to his memory. "I'm going to live the adventures we planned together, and I'm going to do it with enough joy for both of us." The freedom wasn't just about the trip, I realized as I fell asleep surrounded by brochures and boarding passes. The freedom was about remembering that I was someone whose dreams mattered, whose happiness had value, whose life belonged to me rather than to other people's convenience. Tomorrow would bring new attempts to restore the previous dynamic, new strategies for convincing me that my independence was selfishness, my boundaries were cruelty, my self-care was mental illness. But tonight, I was just a woman who'd booked a trip to Greece and bought herself a white dress, who'd remembered that 68 was not too old for adventure and definitely not too late for joy. In 6 weeks, I would be sitting in a taverna overlooking the Aegean Sea, raising a glass of ouzo to the woman I'd become, rather than mourning the woman I'd allowed myself to disappear into. And for the first time in 3 years, that future felt not just possible, but inevitable. The old Margaret had died gradually, quietly, without anyone noticing or mourning her passing. But the new Margaret was being born with celebration, intention, and the kind of fierce joy that comes from choosing yourself after years of choosing everyone else. And this rebirth felt like the best revenge possible against people who'd assumed I was too old, too tired, too grateful for their tolerance to ever demand the respect I'd been earning my entire life. 6 months later, I sat on my terrace in Santorini, watching the sun melt into the Aegean Sea like honey dissolving in blue silk. The whitewashed walls of my small villa glowed pink in the evening light, and the scent of jasmine drifted up from the garden below. In my hands, I held a glass of local wine and a letter that had arrived that morning, forwarded from my old address in Springfield. The letter was from Ben, written on his law firm's letterhead, as if formality might somehow restore the authority he'd lost when I'd stopped funding his comfort. The words were carefully chosen, legal in their precision, therapeutic in their tone, clearly drafted with Tessa's professional guidance and perhaps Patricia's strategic input. "Dear Mom," it began, "we hope this letter finds you well and that you're enjoying your extended vacation. We want you to know that we've all been working very hard to understand the changes you've been going through, and we're ready to discuss a more sustainable arrangement that works for everyone." I set the letter aside without finishing it, more interested in the way the evening light transformed the volcanic cliffs into something that belonged in a fairy tale. Their sustainable arrangement held no appeal for someone who'd discovered that the most sustainable thing of all was living according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. The trip to Greece had lasted 3 weeks, as planned. But somewhere between the ancient ruins of Delphi and the blue dome churches of Mykonos, 3 weeks had evolved into 3 months, and then into something that felt increasingly like home. I'd extended my stay twice, then eventually rented this small villa overlooking the caldera, where I woke each morning to beauty that made my heart race with gratitude. My days had found their own rhythm, one dictated by pleasure rather than obligation. Morning coffee on the terrace while watching fishing boats return to harbor. Afternoon walks through narrow streets where cats sunned themselves on ancient stones. Evening meals at tavernas where the owner, Dimitri, had stopped treating me like a tourist and started treating me like the local I was becoming. "Yasu, Margaret," Dimitri called from his kitchen window as I passed his restaurant. "Will you join us for dinner tonight? My mother is making her famous lamb with lemon and oregano." The invitation wasn't charity or politeness. It was genuine affection from people who'd gotten to know the real Margaret, the one who existed when she wasn't busy making herself invisible for other people's convenience. Here, I was valued for my conversation, my laughter, my appreciation for simple pleasures like perfectly grilled octopus and sunset views that never grew old. I'd made friends in ways I hadn't since my 20s. Before marriage and motherhood had narrowed my social world to family obligations and work relationships. There was Elena, the British expatriate who'd moved to Santorini after her divorce and now ran a small art gallery. Maria, the local woman who'd taught me to make proper Greek coffee and invited me to her granddaughter's baptism. James, the Australian writer who'd been island hopping for 2 years and understood the particular freedom that came from choosing exile over tolerance. "The thing about leaving," James had said one evening as we shared a bottle of wine at Elena's gallery opening, "is that you discover who you really are when you're not busy being who everyone else needs you to be." He was right. Away from the constant pressure to accommodate, apologize, and minimize myself, I'd rediscovered the woman I'd been before I'd learned that love required self-erasure. This Margaret laughed loudly at Dimitri's jokes, wore bright colors that made her feel alive, spoke her opinions without prefacing them with apologies, and took up exactly as much space as she needed without feeling guilty about it. The money that had once flowed toward other people's dreams now funded my own adventures. I'd taken cooking classes where I learned to make dishes that tasted like sunshine. I'd bought art from local painters whose work captured the light in ways that photography couldn't. I'd hired a boat captain to take me to remote beaches where I'd swum in water so clear I could see my feet touching sand 20 feet below. Most surprisingly, I'd started writing. Not anything profound or publishable, just daily observations in a leather journal I'd bought in Athens. Notes about the way morning light painted the church domes gold, descriptions of conversations with strangers who'd become friends, reflections on the difference between being alone and being lonely. I am 70 years old, I'd written just that morning, and I have finally learned the difference between solitude and abandonment. Solitude is chosen, abandonment is imposed. Solitude is peaceful. Abandonment is painful. I have been confusing the two for years, thinking that being alone meant being unwanted, when actually it meant being free. The realization had come gradually, like a sunrise that reveals landscape you didn't know was there. Every morning without someone else's crisis demanding my immediate attention, every meal eaten at my own pace without rushing to serve others, every decision made based on my own preferences rather than someone else's convenience. All of it had accumulated into a deep sense of rightness, of finally living in alignment with my own values. My phone, which had buzzed constantly during my first weeks away with messages ranging from guilt-inducing to borderline threatening, had grown quiet. The emergency they'd tried to create around my absence had eventually revealed itself to be manufactured drama rather than genuine crisis. Ben and Tessa had adjusted their lifestyle to match their actual income. Tessa's business had downsized to sustainable proportions, and the world had continued spinning without Margaret the universal problem solver. The few messages that reached me now were different in tone, less demanding, more cautious, occasionally even apologetic. Ben had sent photos of the garden, now maintained by a landscaping service that cost more than I'd ever spent on household help. Tessa had forwarded articles about the benefits of solo travel for seniors, as if my independence were a phase she was learning to accommodate rather than a choice she needed to respect. But the most meaningful communication had come from an unexpected source. My neighbor's granddaughter, Katie, who'd been 7 when I'd moved in with Ben and Tessa. Now 12 and apparently more emotionally intelligent than the adults in her family, she'd sent a handwritten letter that brought tears to my eyes. "Dear Mrs. Patterson," she'd written in careful cursive, "I miss you a lot. Mom says you're living your best life in Greece and that you're braver than anyone she knows. I think that's really cool. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you and go places that make me happy. Love, Katie." Children, I'd realized, understood adventure in ways that adults had often forgotten. They didn't pathologize independence or medicalize joy. They recognized courage when they saw it and celebrated it without feeling threatened by someone else's freedom. The sun had fully set now, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and gold that would fade into star-scattered darkness. I poured myself another glass of wine and settled deeper into my chair, surrounded by the sounds of evening, distant music from the tavernas below, the soft conversation of couples walking the narrow streets, the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor rocks. Tomorrow, I would decide whether to extend my stay another month or perhaps explore other islands. I had no obligations beyond my own curiosity, no schedule beyond my own preferences, no one to please except myself. The freedom was both exhilarating and peaceful, like floating in warm water under an infinite sky. As I sat there, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, the ghost who'd lived in her own house, the ghost who'd paid for the privilege of being ignored, the ghost who'd believed that love required disappearing. That woman felt like someone I'd known in another lifetime, someone I remembered with compassion but could no longer become. The journey hadn't been about punishing anyone or proving a point. It had been about remembering that I was someone whose happiness mattered, whose dreams had value, whose life belonged to me rather than to other people's convenience. The cruelest thing anyone had done to me wasn't taking my money or dismissing my opinions. It was convincing me that I had no right to exist as anything other than a support system for their comfort. But here, watching stars emerge over the Aegean Sea while jasmine perfumed the air and wine warmed my chest, I understood that the best revenge against people who'd tried to make me invisible was living a life so vibrantly, authentically my own, that they could never again pretend I didn't exist. I raised my glass to the emerging stars, to Harold's memory, to the courage it had taken to choose myself when everyone else had chosen to overlook me. To second chances, I whispered to the night. To late blooming adventures and the sweet taste of freedom. To learning that it's never too late to stop being who others need you to be and start being who you were meant to be. The stars glittered their approval, and somewhere in the distance, Dimitri's mother was probably preparing tomorrow's catch with lemon and herbs, ready to welcome another day in a life where every sunset was a celebration and every sunrise was a promise. I was 70 years old, and I was finally, completely, unapologetically alive. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life, or known someone who gave everything only to be forgotten? Comment below and tell me your story. If this message touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Let's make sure this reaches someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself.